All right, everybody, welcome to the activity Events Leading to the American Revolution. So, what we're going to do for this particular lesson is we're going to read about the text about some of the major events in the years leading up to the Revolutionary War between the American colonies and Great Britain. And we're going to answer a few questions as we read each particular passage. We're going to take a look at a particular act or event, and we're going to answer who was involved, why was it created, and how did the American colonists respond to the particular situation. Then we're going to put it all together. What is the main idea of the passage? So if we're able to answer who was involved, why was it created, and how did the American colonists respond, we're going to be able to answer what the main idea is, because that would clearly give us the particular answer. Okay, so we're going to read the particular text for the Stamp Act first. So this is the first reading. So we're going to read it, and then we're going to answer those questions. So we can see over here, uproar over the Stamp Act. So let's begin. The 7 Years' War in British Debt. Between 1754 and 1763, Britain and France and their respective allies fought in the 7 Years' War. Though the war was triggered by competing colonial claims to the Ohio River Territory of North America, the European allies of both Britain and France quickly became involved, and the scope of the war widened dramatically to include every European great power except the Ottoman Empire. That's modern-day Turkey. The 7 Years' War was a world war that ended with France surrendering all claims to Canada and to territories east of the Mississippi River in Spain, ceding Florida to Britain. Although the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, formally concluding hostilities, was very favorable to Britain, so Britain really benefited from this particular war. But much blood and treasure had been sacrificed in waging the war. After its termination, Britain sought to ease its financial difficulties by taxing the North American colonies. So, let's see what they did. The Stamp Act. The first measure undertaken for this purpose in the colonies was the Stamp Act. In March of 1765, British Prime Minister George Grenville authored the act, which required that all newspapers and documents, including official court documents, in the North American colonies be printed on stamped paper from London. Additionally, the stamped paper had to be purchased in British hard currency, so British money, which was much more rare than the abundant colonial paper currency. So they had money from England. They also had colonial paper currency that the American colonies used as well. The only opposition to the act in Parliament came from William Pitt, Grenville's brother-in-law turned political rival. Pitt challenged Parliament's right to tax the colonists. The British Constitution prohibited or prevented the taxation of British subjects without their consent, which was provided through representation in Parliament. Though the British had imposed or placed restrictions and duties on colonial trade, the passage of the Stamp Act was the first time they had sought to tax the colonists for the explicit purpose of raising revenue or raising money. Prelude to the Revolution. The Stamp Act was greeted with widespread and unconcealed hostility in the colonies. Unfortunately for Parliament, the segments of colonial society that were most detrimentally affected by the act, that would be newspaper printers, students, attorneys, and judges, were also among the most politically active. They mobilized popular opposition to the act, which frequently took the form of street protests that sometimes turned violent. Newspapers ominously predicted the demise of the journalistic profession. While townspeople rioted, colonial assemblies, so that would be local leaders within the colonies themselves, debated. Samuel Adams and Benjamin Franklin were among the most influential voices arguing that since the American colonies were not represented in the British Parliament, the body had no right to tax them. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," arose from colonial opposition to the Stamp Act and proved enduring. So it continued on in the years leading up to the Revolution. The British countered with the theory of virtual representation, which held that members of Parliament were obligated to defend the interests of British subjects and colonists alike. In 1765, delegates from the colonies convened in New York City in the Stamp Act Congress, where they drew up formal petitions to the British Parliament and to King George III to repeal or get rid of the act. It was the first unified colonial response to British policy, and it provided the British a taste of what would come soon thereafter. The British had been receiving reports of mob violence in the colonies, and Prime Minister Grenville had been replaced by Lord Rockingham. What names, by the way, who proved more sympathetic than his predecessor to the colonists' demands. In March of 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed. They got rid of it. But the stage for the American Revolution had been set. Okay, so now let's continue. We've just did our reading. So we want to answer these questions. Who was involved when it came to the Stamp Act? Well, let's take a look. We know it was the British government and the American colonists who were involved in the particular Stamp Act. Those are the two particular individuals who were involved, two groups of individuals. Why was the Stamp Act created? Well, it was created because the British fought the French in the 7 Years' War, with some battles even happening in North America. The British won the war, but it did cost a lot of lives and money. The British directly taxed its North American colonies to help its financial situation. So they wanted to help its financial situation out. So how did the American colonists respond? Well, the American colonists protested the tax on paper goods and argued that the British did not have the right to tax them since they were not represented in Parliament. Okay, so now that we have these three questions answered, that brings us to the main idea. Remember, the main idea should be about 1 to 2 sentences in length. Well, the main idea we have over here: the British government placed the Stamp Act tax on the American colonists to help its financial situation after the 7 Years' War. In response, the American colonists protested this tax on all printed material. All right, at this point in time, everyone, we want to continue taking a look at the remaining particular events and acts that the British did along with the American colonists. And we want to work on getting this done in class. All right, everybody, have a good day. If you have any questions, you could ask me or your teacher.